Hey everybody, it's great to be here. Thanks again for having me this year. So this talk's going to be a little broad. I'm going to start out talking a little bit really quickly about SGN and who we are. Then I'm going to go over sort of our take on the industry and why we've invested in this industry and spent the last 4 years building up our company. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically what I think it takes to be successful in this industry as it continues to shift. So first on SGN, we're a developer of casual mobile games with 12 top 10 hits. We founded the company 4 years ago. We're based in LA and San Francisco. I personally, I'm going to sort of approach this talk both from the perspective of an entrepreneur and also an investor. Although I've been an entrepreneur with this company for the past 4 years, I was an investor previously. And you know, whether we're investing our time or our money, I think approaching an industry and trying to be successful in it, there's a lot of the same criteria and measures. So, you know, we've rolled up casual game studios over the last 4 years. We publish across all game platforms. For us, it's really, really important to be able to develop a game once and have the cost associated with that game, and then get revenues across all platforms, and then allow users to sort of have the pleasure and the ease of being able to play the game wherever they are, anytime. So our top games are Cookie Jam, Paint Monsters, and Panda Pop. Cookie Jam is near the top of the charts right now. It's the #2 match 3 game after Candy Crush. Continues to grow at a ridiculous pace. It's only been out for 4 months. And it continues to fuel a lot of our company growth. So our investment thesis in general and why we started the company is because we feel like the video game industry is completely exploding right now. It's shifting massively, really because the user base is changing. So people now who play video games were people that don't even consider themselves gamers now and never played video games 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And it's the proliferation of mobile devices like, you know, mobile phones and iPads and even Facebook that's completely changed that in the industry. So our belief is that because there's this huge new user base of casual users, basically more than half of the video game players right now are playing casual games, never played games before. We wanted to participate in the casual segment and try and serve this new part of the audience that's now emerging. So first I want to put this really, really quickly into historical context, and this all dates me a little bit, but I started my career in the television business. And first in cable, broadcast thought cable would never succeed, but there were tons of viewers in cable. There was tons of great content. And you know, even though people thought cable networks would never succeed, right now we know they're killing broadcast networks. Web versus television, the same thing happened. They said, web's great, there's tons of viewers, but it's never going to monetize. Now we know web makes more than the television industry as a whole. Social networks versus websites. I was part of the team that bought MySpace 5 years ago when I was at News Corporation. You know, we got it for a very low price because they said social networking, that's user-generated content, that's never going to make any money. And you know, just like, you know, cable television and web before it, if you follow the users, we all know now, Facebook, one of the largest media companies in the world, monetization follows. Last one is mobile gaming versus console gaming. We're going to look at the user base in just a minute, but you're going to see that the users are already there and growing at a much, much faster pace. So ultimately, all the money in our perspective, and this is our investment thesis, is going to go there. So follow the users. So gamers by platform, everyone asks me, you know, are there really more mobile gamers or social gamers than console gamers? You can see here, you know, by many degrees, the numbers are much, much bigger on the social and mobile space. If you stack that up on a growth rate perspective, 25% growth rate, we're going to see mobile expand far beyond social and mobile, social and console. And then on top of that, we're going to see the monetization double and triple. So as a company, it's this segment of the market that we're going for. And we think all the money, or a large proportion of the money, is going to be there. So that's a quick background on why we're focused on social and mobile and why we think most of the estimates on where growth is coming from in the video gaming industry over the next 3 or 4 years are actually underestimating this opportunity. So consumption per user is also increasing. So not only are there more users, but each user is consuming more and more per device or per user, and then the revenue is starting to follow. When we compare that to other industries, film and console are still a lot larger than mobile gaming, but we know that if you look at Candy Crush versus Iron Man versus Grand Theft Auto, the 3 biggest franchises across any platform last year, the mobile and social gaming platform is climbing very, very quickly, and Candy Crush is nipping at the heels of some of the biggest film and console properties. So the next question is, what's the SGN approach? How do we tackle this, and how do we succeed in this space? First is we focus only on casual games. From our perspective, there's this whole new user base. The majority of the user base is brand new to gaming. So being able to serve that audience in a good way is ultimately what we're trying to tackle. That doesn't mean hardcore or midcore doesn't sort of hold a lot of opportunity. We think it does, but focus is really key, and our focus is entirely casual, so we can be the best at that. Next is commitment to quality. There was a time when we focused on getting as many games out as possible. That's no longer the case. Now we make sure each game is the best game in its space. The greenlight process and live game management is something that's very, very key to us. It's basically treating as a game as a service, and being able to kill a game very, very quickly or improve a game if it's not doing what you want it to. So, and last is performance marketing and analytics. It's basically 1/3 of our company, and if you can't accurately track users on a cohort basis in order to understand the analytics and be able to grow a company by buying users, it's going to be very, very hard to have a game that's sustainably at the top 10. So next question, why casual? I touched on it before. It's a large percent of the mobile and social gaming marketplace. 32% is specifically puzzle. If you include time management and other types of casual games, it's actually over 50%. We think it's important for newbies to be able to sort of access a game quickly and be able to succeed in a game quickly in order to get into gaming. So that's another reason why we love casual. The titles are very evergreen, so they have a longer lifespan than many other types of games. And then we think there's interesting room for innovation, and we personally love playing casual and puzzle games, so we love making them. You got to be willing to really, really dedicate yourself to making the absolute best product in the market. That might mean working on a game for 6 months or 9 months or 12 months or longer if you really want it to be the best in the market. And number 2, you got to be committed to bringing it out on all platforms. You can start on one, but for us, if you're acquiring a user and you can only monetize them on, let's say, iOS, which only ends up being 1/3 or 50% of your revenue, you're never going to be able to compete with the other players that can get from the same game double the revenue. So next, whenever we're developing a game, we start with a prototype. We decide if it has big game potential. We'll kill the game if it doesn't. If it does, we go to a full-featured game. And that's generally, the prototype process is generally about a month and a half. Then the full-featured game generally takes 6 to 7 months. After that's created, we look at KPI goals by soft launching the game and really understanding whether it's succeeding. And you can generally tell, even if it's 50% or if it's 75% of the way there, if there's things that can be done that can take it to the next level, or if it's just not going to work for you. So then if the KPI goals just aren't there, you either kill the game or you iterate it, which basically means working on monetization features and retention features in order to improve the game. If you finally get it to the point you need, you launch it, and that might be 9 months later, and it typically is for us, but then once you launch it, then the KPI-driven iteration continues. So if you look at, Cookie Jam, for instance, which we launched 4 months ago, it's a very different game now than when we launched it 4 months ago. And we're launching this month a game called Paint Monsters, working on with Gavorg actually here, who's in the audience. And if you look at that game a month from now when we release it, and then if you look at 6 months from now, you're going to see it's a very different game. And actually seeing how it evolves over that 6-month period is basically a case study in how you improve a game's monetization and retention. So this is our prototype checklist. You know, we look at the market, we look at the monetization, and we look at the scope. How much is this going to cost to be able to successfully achieve? Has to click all these boxes, or else ultimately it's not worth it. So, you know, generally, I'd say about 2/3 of our game become top 20 games, and about 1/3 become top 10 games. And that's because we go through this process every time, and we're committed to doing it right every time. That's, of course, not counting, when I say 1/3 or 2/3, the games that we kill that never actually get released. So marketing is the last bit, and this is sort of a huge generalization on how we approach it, but you got to focus on testing by carrier, by device, time of day, gender, country, and platform. Each of our cohorts will be sort of tweaking each one of these factors for a given game. We have generally about 100 cohorts going at a time, and within 2 or 3 days, we'll be able to decide if we should double or triple a buy or cut back significantly on a buy, which is why generally we're able to buy profitably on a regular basis. And, you know, I think this is very dependent on strong analytics and investing from the outset on having a really deep analytics platform, really good user tracking. We use AdX, and then we have an internal system that actually basically parses through the numbers. But focusing on this at the start is basically what separates the big companies from the smaller but very high quality developers. So, you know, this is something I'm always happy to talk to independent developers about, how to try to build this up, how you can use stuff that's off the shelf if you're not ready to invest in this yourself. But you know, this takes you from a 5 to a 10. So the future of our business. So I think in general, we've shifted from, you know, a very finished product oriented business where you get something out and you're done with it, to one that's very much a product as a service oriented business. I think, frankly, there's very few companies that have been able to sort of really unpack the changes in the industry, who they're trying to serve, and how to succeed in this space. And you can see that in the top grossing list. The top 50 grossing used to have probably twice as many developers as it does now, because the big players are commanding more and more share. If King releases a game, it's almost certainly going to hit the top 50 grossing. You know, Zynga's getting up there. You know, we try to commit to that. If you're an independent player, you can just never do that, which is why there are going to be fewer and fewer places in the top of the charts. And so thinking about how that plays into your strategy as a company, I think, is also going to be key to success, whether you go at it independently or eventually become part of a larger company. So thank you. That's everything. I wanted to leave time for questions. So if anyone has anything they'd like to ask about SGN, our approach to user acquisition, our approach to game development, I'd love to be very open and transparent about that. Yeah?
Can you elaborate on your soft launch process, what that means?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, so when you think about our game development process, I mentioned that there's this, you know, it goes from prototype, and I'm gonna actually unpack the soft launch process from prototype, because there's actually part of the soft launch and data happens there to after the 6-month process. So we have a site called MindJolt, which is a company we acquired that has about 2,000 casual games on it. We put 5 prototypes up a week, which are very small casual games. A lot of them are crowdsourced. They're not necessarily games we've purchased. So starting with that allows us to create a game that we think the mechanic is basically fun, because we've seen 2 or 3 or 4 mechanics, or rather games that are working with that mechanic on MindJolt. Then we spend the 6 months making the game. Then we'll release it, and this gets to your question, I think. We'll release it in soft launch in generally 10 under the profile markets on iOS. And so we're mostly, when we do that launch, we're mostly focused on, I'd say, retention, session length, and sometimes we'll actually have sort of follow-up surveys that we send out to users if they've given their Facebook address, where we actually, or their email address, where we actually ping them and ask them specific questions about that. And that'll usually take about a month and a half to get the data we need. We'll look at early sort of monetization numbers, but typically that's very hard to count on, because it's we're launching in such sort of, let's say, third-tier countries where you don't expect as high monetization. But if you see the retention there, and if you see the session length there, it'll give you a good indication that you're going to be able to build up the game to get to the point you need for the worldwide launch. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I guess just one quick follow-up. Is that, so you do it in a few select countries rather than worldwide? Is that so that when you release it worldwide, you can still gain that what's new feel?
Yeah, it's two reasons. The first one is because I think there's always sort of at the forefront of any release, and this is sort of basically saying yes to your question, there's a group of users that love, let's say, the newest Match 3 game, or the newest Bubble Popper game, or the newest Collapse game, and you're kind of wasting those users who can be very high monetizing and continue to monetize for years after that if you're launching in that market. Number two is a lot of the stores are not going to feature you, frankly, unless you're launching for the first time in that market. So for instance, getting an Apple feature in the US is valuable to us. So we don't want to launch in the US until we really feel like the game's ready for the world. And then we try and get Apple or Google or Amazon behind us. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
Brian Wayne from GameCloud. So I saw that in terms of the platforms that you had talked about, one of them was Safari up there. So I'm assuming HTML5. Is that something that you are pursuing? And if so, what sort of tools are you using for some of your analytics and tracking with HTML5 games?
Good question. So we're actually not developing games in HTML5. Our games are all either Unity or Starling. The reason that was sort of meant to represent browser as a whole. So if a game is very successful, for instance, you can play our game Bingo Blingo at bingoblingo.com. So we'll launch, an actual site where you can access and play the game. We don't do that with all our games, and frankly, it's a much smaller contributor from a revenue standpoint versus iOS or Android or Facebook. But a lot of people don't participate in either social networks, don't have mobile devices, and it's giving them a way to access the game.
What do your demographics look like?
So, look, we're a casual and puzzle game developer, so we skew female. We're about 60-40 female-male. And in terms of age, it's really across the spectrum. I mean, well, let me clarify. We don't really have kids playing our games because they're too hard to play. You'll get through 1 or 2 levels of a puzzle game, and really you're not going to be able to proceed if you're, not a pretty advanced type of player. But from, let's say, 20 to 70, I'd say we're almost evenly spread from a user standpoint.
Do you mind answering one more question? I saw one.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Hi.
Hi, sorry, I'm getting behind the column. Not to get too anal about the soft launch part, but I'd like to circle back to the earlier question.
Sure.
When you talked about assessing the big game potential,
Yep.
besides the gaming dynamics, are there other indicators that you look at that give you a sense of how big the gamer marketplace is for this particular game? And in terms of, numbers and dollars.
Yeah, so, I talked before about retention, and to put specific numbers behind that, we love to get day run retention, which, is actually the second day, but, north of 50%. And there's kind of like a waterfall to day 7 and then day 28. But to be very specific, that's generally what we'll shoot for. Session length really depends on the game and the type of gameplay. Another piece of data you can use, which people don't generally talk about, is you can do actual buys, with test creative, and you can get a sense of, okay, this is a cute, let's say Bubble Popper with pandas. The click-through rate is amazing, and so our marketing is going to be very effective once we release this game. And a lot of people just look at what are the in-game statistics, and being able to also say, look, our marketing campaigns are probably going to be effective, or, for instance, we launched a type of Plinko sort of gambling casino game maybe 3 years ago. It was a very failed exercise, and it was really because there was a very specific niche of user that was interested in that. And so although the retention was great and the monetization was great, there weren't enough people that wanted to play the game. So, and you wouldn't have really seen that from, early data, because you would have seen, 1,000 users come in, and based on those 1,000 users, that's actually too small of a number, but based on those number of users, a certain number did this and a certain number did that, and you'd say, oh my God, this is off the charts. This is a great game. But then you realize on the marketing side that if you have to pay $10 a user and the monetization per user is at 4 or 5, you're completely out of luck. So that's my summary. I'm happy to talk about it in more detail separately if you have any more questions. Okay, sure. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.